Ready? My grandmother paid for this seat!
A flight attendant stood over an 8-year-old girl and her elderly grandmother, her voice dripping with disdain as she pointed toward the back of the plane. The child looked up through thick glasses, her small voice somehow cutting through the tension filling the first-class cabin. My grandmother paid for these seats. We're not moving. The flight attendant's face twisted with contempt, her perfectly painted lips curling into something ugly. Little girl, I don't take orders from children, especially not ones like you. Passengers in nearby rows began turning around, some with curiosity, others with discomfort. What they were about to witness would shake them to their core. Carol Henderson was small for her age, barely 4 feet tall at 8 years old. Her thick glasses constantly slid down her nose, and her hair was pulled into 2 puff balls that bounced when she walked. She wore a purple backpack everywhere she went, covered in butterfly patches that she'd painstakingly sewn on herself over the past year. Each butterfly represented something her mother had taught her before the accident. Carol loved butterflies because her mother once told her they were proof that something small could be transformed into something beautiful and strong. That backpack never left her side. It held everything important to her. A worn photo of her parents, her favorite science books, and right now, her grandmother's medications. Carol was brilliant. She read at a 7th grade level and spent her free time watching documentaries about space and the human body. She dreamed of becoming a doctor one day, though she'd never told anyone except her grandmother. She was painfully shy at school, often eating lunch alone, but when it came to protecting the one person she had left in this world, Carol found a strength that surprised even herself. 2 years ago, a drunk driver had stolen her parents from her in a single devastating moment. Since then, it had been just Carol and her grandmother Ruth against the world. Ruth Henderson was 67 years old, though illness had aged her beyond those years. She'd been an elementary school teacher for 40 years, the kind of teacher who stayed after school to help struggling students, who bought supplies with her own money, who remembered every child's name decades later. She'd raised Carol's mother alone after Carol's grandfather left when her daughter was just a baby. Ruth had done it once and now, in her final years, she was doing it again. She wore a silk scarf wrapped elegantly around her head, covering the hair loss from months of chemotherapy. Even now, even sick, she carried herself with quiet dignity. Ruth had stage 3 lung cancer, and the doctors in Baltimore had given her a timeline nobody should ever have to hear. But there was hope, a small glimmer of it, in Boston. An experimental treatment program at Massachusetts General Hospital. It was expensive. It was far. But it was a chance. The flight attendant demanding they move was named Diane Mercer. She was 42 years old and had worked for the airline for 18 years. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, her uniform pressed with military precision, her smile practiced in front of mirrors until it looked almost real. Almost. But it never reached her eyes. Diane had grown up in privilege, the kind of upbringing where country clubs and private schools were just normal life. She'd married young, divorced young. Married again, divorced again. Somewhere along the way, bitterness had settled into her bones like an old infection. She looked at her job as management, controlling the chaos, making sure people stayed where they belonged. And in her mind, some people simply didn't belong in first class. But let's go back to that morning before the confrontation, before the plane, back to a small apartment in Baltimore where the day had started in a very different way. Carol had woken up at 5 in the morning, even though their flight wasn't until noon. She couldn't sleep. Excitement and terror warred in her chest. She'd never been on a plane before. She'd never been away from Baltimore. But more than that, she knew what this trip meant. It meant hope for her grandmother. It meant possibly more time together. It meant everything. She found Ruth already awake in the bathroom, sitting on the closed toilet lid, trying to muffle her coughing. Carol grabbed a glass of water without being asked, her small hands careful not to spill a drop. She held Ruth's hand as the coughing subsided, feeling how thin her grandmother had become, how fragile. "I'm okay, baby," Ruth whispered, but they both knew it was only partially true. Together they packed Ruth's medications. Carol had made a list the night before, checking it 3 times. She organized the pill bottles in order of when Ruth needed to take them, writing times on sticky notes in her careful, looping handwriting. Morning pills. Afternoon pills. Evening pills. Pain medication if needed. Anti-nausea medication. The inhaler for breathing. Carol packed them all in a clear plastic bag, then packed backup supplies in another bag, because she'd learned that you always needed backups. Ruth watched her granddaughter work with such focus, such maturity, and her heart broke a little more. No 8-year-old should have to know the names of chemotherapy drugs. At the airport, Carol pushed Ruth's wheelchair through the terminal. She could barely see over the handles, had to stand on her tiptoes to properly grip them, but she was determined. Ruth had protested, saying airport staff could push her, but Carol had insisted. "I can do it, Grandma. I'm strong." And she was. Stronger than anyone gave her credit for. Ruth directed her through the crowds, telling her when to turn, when to slow down. "You're my brave girl, Carol," Ruth whispered as they approached their gate. "Just a few more hours and we'll be at the hospital. Just a little while longer." Carol nodded, blinking back tears. She had to be brave. Her grandmother needed her to be brave. When Carol first saw their plane through the terminal window, her eyes went wide. It was massive, bigger than she'd imagined. The wonder of it momentarily pushed aside her fear. She watched it sitting there on the tarmac, powerful and impossible, and felt a flutter of excitement. How did something that big fly? She wanted to understand the physics of it, the mechanics. Maybe one day she'd read about it. But then the fear crept back in. What if something went wrong? What if her grandmother got sicker on the plane? What if the treatment in Boston didn't work? Carol pushed those thoughts down deep and squeezed her grandmother's hand. They boarded early because of Ruth's condition. The gate agent had been kind, letting them go ahead of everyone else, helping Carol collapse the wheelchair. Carol had thanked her 3 times. They walked down the jet bridge slowly, Ruth leaning heavily on Carol's small shoulder. When they stepped onto the plane, a different flight attendant, a younger man with kind eyes, helped them to their seats. 3A and 3B. First class. Ruth had used every penny of her savings for these tickets. She needed the extra space, the ability to recline fully, room to breathe. 4 hours in a cramped economy seat would have been unbearable in her condition. Carol settled her grandmother into the window seat first, then took the aisle seat beside her. She immediately began arranging things with the same careful focus she'd used that morning. She placed Ruth's medications in the seat pocket where she could easily reach them. She adjusted Ruth's pillow, fluffing it and positioning it just right behind her head. She pulled out a blanket from her backpack, one from home that smelled familiar and safe, and tucked it around Ruth's lap. Ruth smiled, her eyes glistening. "What would I do without you?" she whispered. Carol just held her hand as other passengers began boarding, streaming past them toward their seats. If you're moved by Carol's courage and want to see how this story unfolds, hit that subscribe button right now. You won't want to miss what happens next. Carol watched the other passengers with quiet curiosity. A businessman in an expensive suit barely glanced at them as he stowed his leather bag overhead. An elderly white couple took the seats directly in front of them, the woman glancing back with an expression Carol couldn't quite read. A young woman with long dark hair smiled warmly at Carol as she passed. More and more people filled the cabin, and Carol began to relax slightly. They'd made it. They were on the plane. Soon they'd be in the air, and then in Boston, and then at the hospital. Everything would be okay. But then Diane Mercer walked down the aisle, her eyes scanning the first-class cabin with the practiced gaze of someone looking for problems. And when her eyes landed on Carol and Ruth, something flickered across her face. Something cold. She approached them with that fake smile, the one that didn't reach her eyes, and Carol felt her grandmother's hand tighten around hers. What would you do if you saw a child and an elderly woman being treated this way? Would you speak up or would you stay silent? Let me know in the comments below. Diane Mercer approached their row with that smile plastered across her face, the kind of smile that looked friendly from a distance but felt like ice up close. "Excuse me," she said, her voice dripping with false sweetness. "I think there's been a mistake with your seating." Ruth looked up at her, exhaustion evident in every line of her face. Her voice came out weak but steady. "No mistake. These are our seats." Diane's eyes moved slowly, deliberately, scanning Ruth's silk headscarf, then dropping to Carol's worn sneakers, the ones with the hole forming near the big toe that Carol tried to hide by angling her feet inward. You could see the calculation happening behind Diane's eyes, the judgment forming, solidifying into something ugly. "These are premium seats," Diane said, her smile stretching wider, becoming more condescending with each word. "I'm sure you'd be more comfortable in economy. We have some lovely seats in the back." The way she said "the back" carried weight, history, and tension. Carol felt her grandmother's hand tremble in hers. The 8-year-old looked up at this woman who towered over them, confusion and something else, something darker, creeping into her chest. Carol's voice came out quiet but surprisingly firm. "My grandmother paid for these seats. She needs the extra room because she's sick." Diane's smile vanished like someone had flipped a switch. Her face went cold, her eyes hard. "I don't recall asking you, little girl." The dismissiveness in her tone was crushing. the kind of tone that told Carol exactly how little her words mattered to this woman. In seat 4C, just one row back, a businessman named Thomas Whitmore looked up from his laptop. He was in his mid-50s, wearing an expensive suit, the kind of man who was used to first-class cabins and business meetings. He frowned, his attention now fully on the scene unfolding in front of him. Diane leaned in closer, invading their space, her voice dropping to what she probably thought was a reasonable tone. "Look, I'm trying to be nice here. But these seats were obviously purchased by mistake. Let me help you relocate." The condescension dripped from every syllable. The assumption that they couldn't possibly afford these seats, that they didn't belong here, that their presence was somehow an error that needed correcting. Ruth tried to respond, tried to summon the dignified strength she'd carried her whole life, but instead her body betrayed her. The coughing started suddenly, violently, her whole frame shaking with the force of it. Carol moved with practiced efficiency, the kind that comes from months of managing a crisis. She reached into the seat pocket, pulled out her grandmother's inhaler, shook it twice and guided it to Ruth's lips. "Breathe, Grandma," she whispered, her small hand on Ruth's back, rubbing in slow circles the way Ruth had done for her countless times when Carol had nightmares about the accident. The coughing continued, harsh and wet, echoing through the first-class cabin. Other passengers were definitely watching now. Diane stepped backward, her face contorting in disgust. She actually recoiled, as if Ruth's illness was something that might jump across the space between them. "Is she contagious?" Diane demanded, her voice sharp with alarm and accusation. "Other passengers have rights too." The implication hung in the air like poison. The suggestion that Ruth's sickness was somehow an imposition on everyone else, that her very presence endangered them, that she should be hidden away somewhere out of sight. Carol felt something shift inside her chest. The coughing was subsiding now, Ruth's breathing coming in ragged gasps but at least coming. Carol stood up from her seat. She was so small that even standing she barely reached Diane's chest. She had to tilt her head back to look up at the flight attendant's face. Her voice was still quiet, but there was steel in it now, something that surprised even Carol herself. "My grandmother has cancer. It's not contagious. And we're staying in our seats." Diane's face flushed red, anger replacing disgust. Her perfectly composed professional mask was slipping, revealing something raw and bitter underneath. "Sit down. Now," she hissed, her voice low but trembling with rage. "Before I have you removed from this flight." The threat was clear, unmistakable. She wasn't asking. She wasn't requesting. She was demanding compliance, expecting this small child to crumble under her authority. The cabin had gone quiet in that awful way that happens when everyone is pretending not to watch something while watching it intensely. In seats 2A and 2B, the elderly white couple Carol had noticed earlier were whispering to each other, their heads bent close together. The woman kept glancing back at Carol and Ruth, her expression pinched with disapproval. But the disapproval wasn't directed at Diane. They were looking at Carol and Ruth like they were the problem, like they were the ones causing a scene, disrupting the peace of the cabin. In seat 5A, a young woman with long dark hair and warm brown skin had pulled out her phone. Sophia Cruz was 26 years old, a journalist who'd learned long ago that people rarely believed stories of discrimination without proof. Her finger hovered over the record button, then pressed it. She angled her phone carefully, capturing everything while trying to appear casual. In seat 6C, a middle-aged black man named Vernon James was half-standing, his body tense, his jaw clenched. He was 53 years old, a civil rights attorney who'd spent his entire career fighting battles like this one. He recognized what he was seeing. He'd seen it 1,000 times before in 1,000 different contexts. His hands gripped the armrests, knuckles pale with pressure, every instinct telling him to intervene but years of experience warning him to choose his moment carefully. In seats 7A, B, and C, an Asian American mother named Jean Park was trying desperately to distract her two children, a boy of 6 and a girl of 9. She was pulling out coloring books, offering snacks, anything to keep them from seeing this ugly thing unfolding just rows away. But her daughter kept looking around her mother's shoulder, her young face confused, sensing that something was very wrong even if she didn't fully understand what. Thomas Whitmore, the businessman in 4C, had closed his laptop entirely now. He spoke up, his voice carrying the kind of authority that came from boardrooms and corner offices. "Is there a problem here?" These passengers seemed settled. It wasn't aggressive, but it was firm. A statement and a question all at once. Diane spun toward him, her blonde ponytail whipping around. "Sir, this doesn't concern you. I'm handling a seating issue." The dismissiveness was automatic, but there was an edge of frustration now. She didn't like having witnesses. She didn't like her authority being questioned. Thomas didn't back down. Looks like harassment to me. 2 words that changed the entire dynamic. He'd named it. He'd called it what it was. The air in the cabin seemed to thicken. Diane's voice dropped to something icy, dangerous. I suggest you mind your business before you're removed too. It was a threat, thinly veiled. She was willing to escalate this, willing to burn it all down rather than back away. The captain's voice suddenly crackled over the intercom, a routine announcement about preparing for departure, checking seat belts, securing luggage. The normalcy of it felt surreal against the tension crackling through the first-class cabin. Diane's eyes narrowed. She was running out of time. Once they were in the air, her window to act was closing. She turned sharply and stormed toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the curtain that separated first class from the galley. If you can't believe what you're witnessing, make sure you're subscribed because this situation is about to get even more intense. Hit that subscribe button now. Passengers exchanged glances. Some uncomfortable, some angry, some uncertain. Carol sat back down, her heart hammering in her chest. Ruth was still trying to catch her breath, still recovering from the coughing fit. I'm sorry, baby, Ruth whispered, tears streaming down her cheeks. I'm so sorry. Carol shook her head fiercely. You didn't do anything wrong, Grandma. You didn't do anything wrong. But the words felt hollow because they both knew that in Diane's eyes, their very existence in these seats was the wrongdoing. Diane returned moments later and she wasn't alone. Another flight attendant followed behind her, a younger man who looked deeply uncomfortable. Kevin Park was 28 years old, had been with the airline for just under 3 years, and was already regretting whatever he'd agreed to. Diane was his senior, his supervisor, and when she demanded he come with her, he hadn't felt like he could refuse. But now, standing in front of this small child and this clearly ill elderly woman, every instinct in his body was screaming that this was wrong. Diane, maybe we should just, Kevin started, his voice low, trying to give her an out, a way to de-escalate. Diane cut him off with a sharp gesture. Check their tickets. Something's wrong here. It wasn't a request. It was an order. Carol reached into her grandmother's purse with shaking hands and pulled out their boarding passes. They were pristine, legitimate, printed on the airline's official paper with all the correct codes and confirmation numbers. She handed them to Kevin, not to Diane. Kevin took them gently, his eyes apologetic. He scanned them carefully, checked the seat numbers, checked the passenger names. Everything matched. Everything was in order. He looked up at Diane, his discomfort growing. Everything checks out, Diane. Diane snatched the boarding passes from his hands, her eyes scanning them frantically as if she could will them to be fraudulent through sheer force of belief. Her face was red now, her breathing quick. She was in too deep, had committed too hard, and couldn't find a way out that didn't involve backing down. And backing down felt impossible to her. These must be fraudulent, she announced loudly, her voice carrying through the cabin. Nobody in their situation flies first class. Nobody in their situation. The words hung in the air like a slap. She'd said it out loud, the quiet part, the part that was supposed to stay internal. She'd revealed exactly what this was about. Ruth's voice came out broken, pleading in a way that shattered something inside Carol. Please, Ruth whispered, and you could hear 40 years of dignity crumbling in that single word. We just want to get to Boston. My treatment. She couldn't finish. The words dissolved into another cough, weaker this time, more defeated. Carol's eyes filled with tears, hot and stinging, blurring her vision. But she didn't let them fall. She blinked hard, forcing them back because if she started crying she might not stop. Her voice came out small and bewildered, the voice of a child who genuinely couldn't understand the cruelty she was experiencing. Why are you doing this to us? Diane looked down at her, and for just a moment, something flickered across her face. Was it guilt? Shame? But it disappeared almost instantly, replaced by defensive hostility. I'm doing my job, sweetie, she said, and the fake endearment was somehow worse than an insult. Some people try to sneak into places they don't belong. Vernon James had heard enough. The attorney stood fully now, his considerable height making him impossible to ignore. His voice was deep, authoritative, carrying the weight of courtrooms and legal battles. That's enough. You're bullying a sick woman and a child. He wasn't asking. He was stating a fact. Diane whirled on him and you could see her unraveling, her control slipping away piece by piece. Sit down, she shouted, abandoning all pretense of professionalism. All of you. Or I'll have security remove anyone who interferes. The threat was wild now, desperate. She was threatening to remove multiple passengers, turning this into a full-scale incident, but she was too far gone to care. Sophia, still recording, murmured loudly enough for those nearby to hear, "This is insane." Her video was capturing everything. Diane's red face, Carol's tears, Ruth's trembling hands, the gathering storm of passenger reaction. The elderly couple in 2A and 2B were still whispering, and the woman's voice carried just far enough for Carol to hear the worst possible words. "Well, if the flight attendant says there's an issue?" Siding with authority. Siding with Diane. Assuming that if this woman in a uniform was making accusations, there must be truth to them. The casual complicity of it was devastating. Have you or someone you know ever experienced discrimination like this? Share your story in the comments. Your voice matters. Carol looked around the cabin at all these adults, all these people who could help, and saw a divide forming. Some were clearly on their side. Thomas, Vernon, Sophia, Jean with her children. But others were silent, uncomfortable but unwilling to act. And some, like the elderly couple, had already chosen a side, and it wasn't Carol's. The 8-year-old felt the weight of something she was too young to fully name but old enough to feel crushing down on her chest. Injustice. Hatred. The realization that sometimes the world was cruel for no reason other than cruelty itself. Ruth was crying openly now, tears streaming down her face, her body shaking with exhaustion and humiliation and the physical toll of her illness. Carol held her grandmother's hand and felt it trembling like a bird's wing. Everything in Carol's small body wanted to make this stop, wanted to protect her grandmother from this pain. But she didn't know how. She was 8 years old and she didn't know how to fight a system, an institution, an adult with authority who'd already decided they didn't belong. Kevin stood frozen, caught between his supervisor's orders and his own conscience, visibly torn but ultimately silent. Diane stood triumphant and terrible, her chest heaving, her eyes bright with righteous anger, convinced somehow that she was the victim in this scenario, that these passengers were threatening her, disrespecting her authority, making her job difficult. The cognitive dissonance required to maintain that belief was staggering, but she'd built walls around herself so thick that reality couldn't penetrate. The captain's voice came over the intercom again, announcing final preparations for departure. Minutes were ticking by. The plane needed to leave. And somehow this situation needed to resolve. But how it would resolve, and who would emerge with their dignity intact, remained terrifyingly uncertain. Ruth's voice came out as barely a whisper, so quiet that Carol had to lean in close to hear it. "Carol baby, maybe we should just move." "I can't. I don't have the strength." The defeat in those words was absolute, crushing. This woman who had raised a daughter alone, who had taught children for 4 decades, who had survived her husband leaving, her daughter dying, and now cancer eating away at her body, this woman was finally, completely broken. Carol looked at her grandmother's face, pale as paper, gray around the edges like she was fading into nothing. Ruth's hands were trembling uncontrollably now, not just from the illness but from humiliation, from exhaustion, from the soul-deep weariness that comes from being treated as less than human. Carol saw all of this in a single moment. She saw 40 years of her grandmother's dignity being stripped away. She saw the woman who had held her through nightmares, who had packed her lunches with little notes that said, "I love you," who had learned to braid hair by watching YouTube videos because she wanted Carol to feel pretty on her first day of 3rd grade. She saw the only family she had left in this world being destroyed by a stranger's cruelty. And something happened inside Carol's 8-year-old chest. Something hardened, crystallized, transformed from fear into fury, from uncertainty into absolute clarity. Carol stood up, but she didn't just stand in the aisle. She climbed onto her seat. Her worn sneakers pressed into the expensive first-class leather as she rose up, until suddenly she was eye level with Diane Mercer. The flight attendant took an involuntary step backward, startled by the sight of this tiny child elevated, no longer looking up but looking directly at her. Carol's thick glasses had slid down her nose. She pushed them back up with one finger, a gesture so childlike and innocent that it made what happened next even more powerful. "My grandmother was a teacher for 40 years. Carol's voice wasn't loud, but it cut through the cabin like a blade. Every conversation stopped. Every passenger turned. Every eye fixed on this small girl standing on a first-class seat with her butterfly-covered backpack still on her shoulders. She taught kids like you when nobody else wanted to. She taught in schools where other teachers quit after a month. She used her own money to buy supplies because the school district wouldn't. She stayed late to help students who had nobody at home to help them with homework. She never gave up on anyone." Carol's voice was shaking now, but she kept going, the words pouring out like they'd been building inside her for hours, days, years. "She saved every penny for this ticket. Every single penny. Because the doctors in Baltimore said she only has months to live. Months. The doctors in Boston might be able to save her. Might be able to give us more time. That's all we want. Just more time together. Diane opened her mouth to interrupt, but Carol didn't stop. Couldn't stop. We're flying first class because she can't sit cramped in the back for 4 hours. She can barely breathe. She needs space. She needs to be able to recline. She needs to be comfortable because every moment hurts her now. Every single moment. And we paid for these seats. We paid for them with money my grandmother saved while she was getting poison pumped into her body every week, while she was losing her hair, while she was so sick she couldn't eat for days. The cabin had gone completely silent. Not the uncomfortable silence from before, but something different. Something sacred and terrible. People had stopped pretending not to watch. They were watching openly now, and many of them had tears in their eyes. Sophia was still recording, but her hands were shaking. Vernon's jaw was clenched so tight it looked painful. Thomas had his hand over his mouth. Jean had given up trying to distract her children. Her 9-year-old daughter was crying openly. Carol's voice cracked, the 8-year-old facade breaking to reveal the frightened, grieving child underneath. But she pushed through it. My parents died when I was 6. A drunk driver hit their car. I was in the back seat. I survived. They didn't. My grandmother was 65 years old, retired, ready to rest after working her whole life. But she took me in. She became my mother and father both. She learned to braid hair and help with science projects and make pancakes shaped like stars because that's what my mom used to do. Tears were streaming down Carol's face now, but her voice grew stronger, not weaker. My grandmother is all I have in this entire world. She's everything. And you're treating her like she's nothing. Like we're nothing. Because of how we look. Because you looked at her headscarf and my old shoes and decided we couldn't possibly belong here. You decided we must have stolen these tickets or made a mistake or that we're trying to trick someone. You didn't see a teacher and a little girl. You just saw something you didn't like. Diane's face had gone from red to purple. How dare you accuse me of, she started, her voice high and defensive, but Carol cut her off. The 8-year-old who had been so shy, so quiet, who ate lunch alone at school because she was afraid to talk to other kids, that 8-year-old raised her voice and spoke over a grown woman. I'm 8 years old and I can see what you're doing. Carol's voice filled the cabin, bouncing off the walls, impossible to ignore. I'm 8 years old and I know this is wrong. Why can't you? Why can't you see it? What's wrong with you that you can look at a sick woman and a little girl and decide to hurt us? What kind of person does that? The question hung in the air like an indictment. Diane stood there, her mouth opening and closing, no words coming out. For the first time since this started, she looked uncertain. Not apologetic, not ashamed, but uncertain. Like she was suddenly aware that everyone was watching her, judging her, recording her, and maybe, just maybe, history wouldn't be kind. Thomas Whitmore stood up from his seat, his phone already in his hand. His voice was cold, businesslike, the voice of someone used to wielding power. I'm calling the airline's corporate office. This is discrimination. This is a clear violation and I'm reporting it right now. His fingers were already moving across his screen, pulling up contacts, making the threat real and immediate. Vernon James spoke next, his deep voice carrying authority that came from years in courtrooms. I'm a lawyer. Civil rights attorney. And this is a textbook civil rights violation. I'm witnessing it. I'm documenting it. And I'm prepared to testify to everything I've seen here. He pulled out his own business card, held it up so Diane could see it so she could read the firm name and understand exactly who she was dealing with. Sophia raised her phone higher, no longer trying to be subtle about recording. I'm posting this everywhere. Every social media platform I have. This video is going viral. The whole world will see what you've done here. And the way she said it, calm and factual, made it clear this wasn't a threat. It was a promise. It was already happening. Jean Park had tears streaming down her face as she looked at Diane with something close to disgust. My children shouldn't have to witness this hatred. They shouldn't have to see an adult treat people this way. What am I supposed to tell them? How do I explain this? Her 9-year-old daughter was staring at Carol with wide, confused eyes, trying to understand why the flight attendant was being mean to the little girl and her grandma. Kevin, the younger flight attendant who had been standing frozen this entire time, finally found his voice. He leaned close to Diane, his whisper urgent and frightened. Diane, stop. Please stop. You're going to get us all fired. This is going too far. We need to, but Diane wasn't listening. She couldn't listen. She'd gone too far to turn back, had invested too much pride in being right to admit she was wrong. Admitting she was wrong would mean admitting what she'd done, what she'd become, and her entire self-image couldn't survive that admission. Diane's hand shot out and pressed the call button for the cockpit. It was a desperate move, the action of someone drowning and grabbing at anything within reach. She needed authority on her side. She needed someone else to validate her position, to back her up, to make this all okay. The button glowed red, and somewhere in the cockpit an alert sounded. Moments later, the cockpit door opened and Captain Mitchell Rodriguez emerged. He was 55 years old, built like someone who'd spent time in the military and never quite lost that bearing. His hair was gray at the temples, his face weathered and serious. He'd been flying for 30 years, had seen countless passenger conflicts, and had developed an instinct for when something was genuinely wrong versus when someone was wasting his time. His eyes swept the first-class cabin, taking in the scene with quick efficiency. A child standing on a seat. An elderly woman who looked half dead. A flight attendant who was visibly agitated. Other passengers on their phones, recording, angry. "Captain," Diane's voice came out breathless, rushed, "we have passengers causing a disturbance. They're refusing to follow crew instructions. I need them removed before we can depart." She said it with confidence, like she was reporting a simple problem that required a simple solution. Remove the problem passengers, restore order, move on. Captain Rodriguez looked at Carol, still standing on her seat, tiny and defiant with her butterfly backpack and her tear-streaked face. He looked at Ruth, slumped in her window seat, barely conscious, clearly ill. His eyes moved to Diane, then to the other passengers, reading the room with the skill of someone who'd spent decades managing human behavior at 30,000 feet. When he spoke, his voice was measured, careful. "What instructions exactly?" Diane gestured at Carol and Ruth like they were exhibits in a trial. "I asked them to relocate due to seating irregularities." Even she seemed to realize how flimsy that sounded. The pause before "seating irregularities" was damning. It was the sound of someone searching for official-sounding language to disguise something ugly. Captain Rodriguez's eyes narrowed slightly. "Their tickets valid?" He directed the question at Kevin, not Diane. Smart man. He'd already assessed who was reliable here. Kevin nodded quickly, grateful to be asked something he could answer honestly. "Yes, sir. Everything checks out. Legitimate purchase, correct seats, all documentation in order." The captain turned back to Diane, and there was something in his gaze now, something sharp and unforgiving. "Then what's the problem?" Diane stammered, her carefully constructed authority crumbling. "I just thought they seemed more suited for..." She trailed off, unable to finish the sentence because any way she finished it would reveal exactly what this was about. "For what, Diane?" The captain's voice was quiet, but it cut like a razor. Those 3 words were an interrogation, a judgment, and a trap all at once. He was giving her one chance to explain herself, and they both knew there was no explanation that wouldn't condemn her. If this story is gripping you, don't miss what happens next. Hit subscribe right now because the resolution will leave you speechless. The silence that followed was excruciating. Diane's mouth opened and closed like a fish gasping for air. Her face was scarlet, sweat beading on her forehead despite the cool air of the cabin. Around them, passengers waited, holding their collective breath. Carol still stood on her seat, smaller than everyone else but somehow towering over them all. Ruth had opened her eyes and was watching with an expression of exhausted hope, like she didn't dare believe this might actually end in their favor. The entire first-class cabin had become a courtroom, and Diane Mercer was on trial with no defense attorney, no prepared statement, and no way out. What would you have done if you were a passenger on this flight? Would you have stood up like Thomas and Vernon, or would you have stayed silent? Tell us honestly in the comments below. Captain Rodriguez's voice cut through the tension like a command from a general on a battlefield. "Diane. Kevin. Galley. Now." It wasn't a request. It wasn't even really an order. It was the voice of someone who had seen enough, heard enough, and was done tolerating what was happening in his aircraft. Diane's face went pale, then red again, cycling through colors like a broken traffic light. Kevin looked relieved, like he'd been waiting for someone with actual authority to step in and end this nightmare. They both followed the captain toward the front of the plane, disappearing behind the galley curtain that separated first class from the crew area. For a moment, the cabin remained silent. Then the voices started. They were muffled by the curtain and the distance but not muffled enough. The captain's voice rose first, deep and harsh, the words indistinct but the anger unmistakable. Diane's voice came next, high-pitched and defensive, trying to explain, trying to justify. The captain's voice cut her off, louder now, and passengers in the front rows could make out phrases. Unacceptable. Disgraceful. Everything this airline stands against. Diane's voice rose to match his, then broke into something that sounded like crying. The argument continued, voices rising and falling, and every passenger in first class listened with rapt attention, their eyes fixed on that curtain like it was a stage and they were waiting for the final act. Carol finally climbed down from her seat, her legs shaking so badly she nearly fell. She collapsed into the aisle seat next to her grandmother, suddenly feeling every ounce of adrenaline drain from her small body. She felt hollowed out, exhausted in a way that went beyond physical tiredness. Ruth reached for her, pulling Carol close, and they sat there clinging to each other while the cabin buzzed with activity around them. Thomas Whitmore unbuckled his seatbelt and moved to kneel in the aisle beside Carol's seat, bringing himself down to her eye level. His expensive suit wrinkled against the airplane floor, but he didn't seem to care. "You did great, kiddo," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "What you just did, standing up like that took real courage. More courage than most adults I know possess." He pulled out his wallet and extracted his own business card. "I'm serious about calling corporate. I'm going to make sure they know exactly what happened here. And if you or your grandmother need anything at all, you call me." He pressed the card into Carol's small hand. Sophia had moved closer too, her phone still out but no longer recording. She crouched down in the aisle, her dark eyes fierce and determined. "I got everything on video," she said, making sure both Carol and Ruth could hear her clearly. Every single word, every expression on her face, all of it. "That flight attendant is done. Her career is over. This is going viral the second we land and I get signal. The whole world is going to see what she did to you." There was satisfaction in her voice, the satisfaction of someone who documented injustice and was about to expose it to the light. Vernon James approached more formally, his lawyer instincts evident in how he presented himself. He handed Ruth his business card with both hands, a gesture of respect. "Ma'am, my name is Vernon James. I'm a civil rights attorney, and I witnessed everything that happened here. If you want to pursue legal action against this airline, against that flight attendant personally, call me. Pro bono. No charge. I would be honored to represent you." Ruth took the card with trembling fingers, too overwhelmed to speak, but she nodded. She understood what he was offering. Justice. Accountability. The chance to make sure this never happened to anyone else. Jean Park's children had been busy during the confrontation's aftermath. Her 9-year-old daughter had pulled out coloring supplies from her backpack, and she and her 6-year-old brother had been drawing frantically. Now they approached Carol shyly, the girl holding out several pieces of paper. "We made these for you," she said quietly. The drawings were butterflies, dozens of them, colored in crayon and marker, some realistic and some fantastical with rainbow wings and glitter. "Because of your backpack," the little boy added, pointing at Carol's butterfly patches. "We thought you liked butterflies." Carol took the drawings, and something about this simple kindness from other children broke through her defenses. Her eyes filled with fresh tears, but she smiled. "Thank you," she whispered. "They're beautiful." The elderly couple in seats 2A and 2B hadn't moved, hadn't said a word. But the woman's face had changed. The disapproval was gone, replaced by something that looked like shame. She kept glancing back at Carol and Ruth, then looking away quickly, her hands twisting in her lap. Her husband stared straight ahead, his jaw set, but his wife's eyes were red-rimmed. She'd watched a child defend her dying grandmother and had initially sided with the authority figure. Now she was confronting what that said about her, and the reflection wasn't kind. She didn't apologize. Some people never do. But the shame was visible, and maybe that was something. The galley curtain moved and Diane emerged. Her face was blotchy from crying, her perfect makeup destroyed by tears and smeared mascara. Her blonde hair had come loose from its bun, wisps hanging around her face. She looked destroyed, hollowed out, like someone who just watched their entire life collapse. She walked down the aisle with her head down, not making eye contact with anyone, and disappeared toward the back of the plane. A few passengers watched her go with satisfaction. Others with pity. Carol just felt tired. She didn't feel victorious. She didn't feel happy. She just felt exhausted and sad that any of this had been necessary. Kevin emerged next, and his face told a completely different story. He looked sick with guilt and relief in equal measure. He approached Carol and Ruth slowly, his hands clasped in front of him like a penitent at confession. "I'm so sorry," he said, and his voice cracked on the words. "That was wrong. What she did was wrong, and I should have stopped it sooner. I should have stood up for you immediately, and I didn't, and I'm so sorry." He was crying now, this young man barely into his career, confronting his own failure to act. "Is there anything I can get you? Water? Juice? Extra blankets?" Anything at all? Carol looked up at him, this adult man crying and apologizing to her, and she felt that same protectiveness she'd felt for her grandmother. She reached out and patted his hand. "Ginger ale for my grandmother, please," she said softly, slipping back into her role as Ruth's caretaker. "And crackers. The plain ones. They help with her nausea." Kevin nodded frantically, grateful for a concrete task, something he could actually do to help. "Yes, of course, right away. And for you?" Carol thought for a moment. "Apple juice." Kevin smiled through his tears. "Apple juice and anything else you want? I'll bring you both the whole beverage cart if you'd like." The intercom crackled to life, and Captain Rodriguez's voice filled the cabin. It was a different voice than the one that had been yelling in the galley. This was his professional voice, but underneath it you could hear steel. "Ladies and gentlemen, we apologize for the delay. We'll be departing shortly." He paused, and the pause was deliberate, weighted with meaning. "Let me be clear about something. This airline has zero tolerance for discrimination of any kind. Zero. Every passenger who paid for their seat has earned their place on this aircraft. Your race, your religion, your appearance, your socioeconomic status. None of those things determine your right to be here. Your ticket determines your right to be here. And if you have a valid ticket, you belong in that seat. Period." Another pause. "We're proud to serve all passengers, and we're grateful for the privilege of flying you to your destination today. We'll have you in Boston on time. Thank you for your patience." The announcement ended, and for a moment the cabin was silent again. Then something extraordinary happened. Vernon James started clapping. It began as a slow clap, deliberate and meaningful, his large hands coming together with force that echoed through the cabin. Sophia joined immediately, then Thomas. Jean and her children. The businessman in seat 8A. The young couple in 10C. The clapping spread like wildfire through first class, then through the curtain into economy, passengers who'd heard the commotion or sensed something significant had happened joining in without fully understanding why. Within seconds the entire plane was filled with applause. Carol looked around, completely bewildered. People were clapping and looking at her. Smiling at her. Some were crying. She didn't understand. She'd just been trying to protect her grandmother. She'd just been trying to explain why they deserved to stay in their seats. She hadn't been trying to be brave or make a speech or change anything. She'd just been a scared little girl defending the only family she had left. But these adults were treating her like she'd done something heroic. Ruth squeezed Carol's hand so tightly it almost hurt, and when Carol looked up at her grandmother, she saw tears streaming down Ruth's face. But these weren't tears of pain or humiliation or defeat. These were different. "You did good, baby," Ruth whispered, her voice breaking with emotion and pride and love so overwhelming it couldn't be contained. "You did so good. So good." She pulled Carol close, holding her granddaughter against her chest, and Carol could feel Ruth's heart beating, fast and strong despite the illness. Still alive. Still here. Still together. If you've been moved by Carol's courage, make sure you subscribe because stories like this need to be shared. Hit that button right now. Carol finally let herself cry. All the fear she'd been holding back, all the terror of losing her grandmother, all the confusion about why that flight attendant had been so mean, all the exhaustion from being strong when she wanted to be small, it all poured out in great, heaving sobs. She cried into her grandmother's chest while the plane applauded around them, and Ruth held her and rocked her and whispered, "It's okay now, baby. It's over. We're okay. We're going to be okay." Kevin returned with a tray loaded down with drinks and snacks. Ginger ale and crackers for Ruth. Apple juice for Carol. But also cookies, pretzels, chocolate bars, packages of nuts, fruit cups. "I grabbed everything I thought you might like," he said, setting the tray down carefully. He also had blankets, the nice thick ones usually reserved for international flights, and a small stuffed airplane toy he'd found somewhere in the crew supplies. "For you," he said, handing the toy to Carol. She took it, clutching it against her chest along with her butterfly backpack. Kevin knelt down one more time. "What you did was incredibly brave. I hope when I have kids someday they turn out half as courageous as you." Then he stood and went back to his duties, leaving Carol and Ruth with more provisions than they could possibly consume. The plane began to move, backing away from the gate, beginning the slow taxi toward the runway. The hum of the engines grew louder, and Carol felt the vibration through her seat. They were really leaving. After everything, they were actually going to Boston. The pilot hadn't kicked them off. They were going to make it to the hospital. Ruth was going to get her treatment. Carol pressed her face against the window, watching the terminal slide past, then the other planes, then the vast expanse of runway. Ruth's breathing had eased. The terrible tension that had been making her shoulders rigid, that had been restricting her lungs, had finally released. The stress was lifting, replaced by exhaustion but also relief. She leaned her head back against the seat and closed her eyes, and for the first time in hours she looked peaceful. Carol watched her grandmother's chest rise and fall, each breath a little easier than the last, and felt something loosen in her own chest. They'd made it through. Together. Carol opened her purple backpack with its butterfly patches and reached into the front pocket where she kept her most precious possession. She pulled out a photograph, worn at the edges from being held so many times. Her parents smiled out from the picture, young and happy, frozen in a moment before everything changed. Her mother's arm was around her father's waist. They were at a park somewhere, sunshine behind them, laughing at something outside the frame. Carol had been 3 when this photo was taken. She barely remembered it being taken, but she'd memorized every detail of the image. Her mother's smile. Her father's laugh lines. The way they looked at each other even while looking at the camera. Carol held the photo in both hands, her thumbs gentle on the edges so she wouldn't damage it further. She looked at her mother's face and whispered, so quietly that only Ruth could have heard if she'd been awake, "I protected her, Mama. I protected Grandma like you asked me to." Those had been some of her mother's last words, spoken in the hospital after the accident, before the machine stopped beeping and the doctors said there was nothing more they could do. Carol had been 6 years old, sitting in a chair too big for her, and her mother had taken her hand with the little strength she had left. "Take care of Grandma for me," she'd whispered. "Protect her. Love her. She's going to take care of you, but you take care of her too. Promise me, baby." And Carol had promised, not really understanding what she was promising, not knowing she'd have to keep that promise her whole life. But today she kept it. When it mattered most, when her grandmother was being hurt and humiliated, Carol had found the strength her mother had believed she possessed. She'd stood up. She'd spoken out. She'd protected her grandmother the way her mother had asked her to. Carol kissed the photograph gently and tucked it back into her backpack, zipping it carefully closed. The plane turned onto the runway, the engines roaring to life with power that made the whole aircraft vibrate. Carol grabbed her grandmother's hand again, partly from the nervousness of takeoff and partly just because she needed to hold it. Ruth's eyes opened and she smiled at Carol, squeezed her hand back. The plane accelerated faster and faster, the world outside the window becoming a blur. Then that magical moment when the ground fell away and they were airborne, climbing into the sky, leaving Baltimore behind and heading toward Boston, toward the hospital, toward hope. Carol pressed her forehead against the window and watched the city grow smaller beneath them, watched the world transform into a patchwork of colors and shapes. She'd stood up to an adult. She'd given a speech in front of a plane full of strangers. She'd made people cry and clap and believe in something. And she was 8 years old. Just 8 years old with thick glasses and a butterfly backpack and a sick grandmother and parents who lived now only in photographs. But today she'd been enough. She'd been more than enough. She'd been exactly what her grandmother needed her to be. What would you tell Carol if you could speak to her right now? Share your message in the comments below. She deserves to know how many people are inspired by her courage. The flight attendant call light dinged softly, and Kevin appeared almost immediately, attentive and eager to help. "Everything okay?" he asked gently. Ruth nodded, smiling. "Everything's perfect." And impossibly, despite the cancer and the confrontation and the exhaustion, in that moment it was true. They were on their way to Boston. They were together. They'd survived something terrible and come out the other side with their dignity intact. Carol was holding her hand, the plane was carrying them toward hope, and the world below was full of possibility. Everything for now was perfect. The story of what happened on that flight didn't end when the plane touched down in Boston. In fact, in many ways that's where the real story began. Ruth Henderson did receive the experimental treatment at Massachusetts General Hospital. The doctors there were kind, thorough, and honest. They told her what Carol already knew in her heart: the cancer was terminal. There would be no miracle cure, no complete recovery, no return to the life before the diagnosis. But the treatment could buy time. Precious, valuable time. And that's exactly what it did. The treatment gave Ruth an additional 18 months of quality time with Carol. 18 months that shouldn't be measured in days or weeks, but in moments. 18 months of morning pancakes shaped like stars. 18 months of helping with homework and tucking Carol into bed. 18 months of birthday parties and holidays and ordinary Tuesdays that became extraordinary simply because they were together. 18 months of Carol coming home from school and finding her grandmother waiting, tired but present, sick but alive. Ruth got to see Carol turn 9, then 10. She got to watch her granddaughter grow taller, more confident, more determined. She got to see the seeds of the woman Carol would become beginning to take root. Those 18 months were everything. They were the gift that the treatment in Boston provided, and they were worth every moment of that terrible flight, every ounce of humiliation, every second of fear. Because in the end, time with the people we love is the only thing that really matters. Ruth used those months to teach Carol everything she could. How to be strong. How to be kind. How to stand up for what's right even when your voice shakes. How to love fiercely and completely. How to survive grief and still find joy. She poured 40 years of teaching experience and 67 years of life wisdom into her granddaughter, knowing that soon Carol would have to face the world without her. When Ruth finally passed away, Carol was 9.5 years old. Too young to lose another parent, too young to attend a funeral for the second time in her short life, too young to understand why the world kept taking away everyone she loved. But she was surrounded by people who'd been strangers on a plane 18 months earlier and had become family. Thomas Whitmore was there. Vernon James was there. Sophia Cruz was there. Jean Park and her children were there. Even Captain Rodriguez came, his uniform pressed and perfect, his weathered face lined with genuine grief for a woman he'd only briefly met but would never forget. Carol Henderson is 11 years old now. She still lives in Baltimore in the same small apartment she shared with her grandmother, but she's not alone. A distant aunt, Ruth's niece, moved in to care for her. The aunt is kind but busy, working 2 jobs to make ends meet, so Carol has learned to be independent in ways that most 11-year-olds aren't. She still wears thick glasses that slide down her nose. She still carries that purple backpack with the butterfly patches, though she's added more over the years. Each butterfly represents something important now. One for her mother, one for her father, one for Ruth, and dozens more for lessons learned in battles fought and moments that shaped who she's becoming. Carol wants to be a doctor. Not just wants, is determined to be a doctor. She studies harder than anyone in her grade. She reads medical textbooks from the library that are meant for high school students, college students, adults. She watches surgical videos online and takes notes in careful handwriting. She volunteers at a local community health clinic, filing papers and greeting patients, absorbing everything she can about how medicine works, how doctors think, how healing happens. The nurses there have adopted her as their unofficial mascot, this tiny, serious girl who asks questions that reveal a depth of understanding far beyond her years. But Carol isn't just focused on her own future. She speaks at local schools about standing up against injustice. At first, adults arrange these speaking engagements, thinking it would be good for other children to hear Carol's story. But Carol has made it her mission. She goes to elementary schools, middle schools, community centers, churches. She stands in front of rooms full of kids and tells them what happened on that plane. She tells them about being scared and small and facing an adult who had all the power. And then she tells them that she spoke up anyway. That her voice mattered even though she was just 8 years old. That their voices matter too. You don't have to wait until you're grown up to make a difference, Carol tells audiences of wide-eyed children. You don't have to be big or strong or powerful. You just have to care enough to say something when you see something wrong. She's inspired countless kids to speak up about bullying, discrimination, unfairness in their own lives. Teachers have written to her aunt, telling stories of students who found their courage because of Carol. It's a legacy that would make Ruth proud beyond measure. Diane Mercer's story took a very different path. She was terminated by the airline within 48 hours of the incident. The investigation was swift and conclusive. Multiple passenger testimonies, Sophia's video evidence, Captain Rodriguez's detailed report. There was no ambiguity about what had happened. Diane was fired for gross misconduct, violation of company policy, and discrimination. But it didn't stop there. The airline industry is smaller than people realize and word travels fast. Diane was effectively blacklisted, banned from working for any commercial airline. Her 18 years of experience, her seniority, her entire career, gone. She faced no criminal charges. What she did was morally reprehensible and professionally disastrous, but it wasn't criminal. She couldn't be arrested for being cruel, for being prejudiced, for abusing her authority in ways that shattered a child's sense of safety. The legal system has limits. Justice and legality aren't always the same thing. Diane Mercer disappeared from public view. Some say she moved to another state. Others heard she tried to reinvent herself in a completely different field. But her name, her face, her actions, they're immortalized on the internet now, permanent and searchable, a cautionary tale about what happens when hatred masquerades as policy. Sophia Cruz's video changed everything. She posted it within an hour of landing in Boston, uploading it to every social media platform she had. The response was immediate and explosive. Within 24 hours, the video had 1 million views. Within a week, 10 million. By the end of the month, over 40 million people had watched an 8-year-old girl stand on an airplane seat and defend her dying grandmother. 40 million people heard Carol's voice crack as she asked why they were being treated like nothing. 40 million people saw Diane's face redden with anger and shame. 40 million people witnessed what discrimination looks like in real time. The video sparked national conversations about bias in service industries, about how children perceive injustice, about the responsibility of bystanders to intervene. News networks picked up the story. Carol's face appeared on television, though her aunt carefully limited interviews to protect her privacy. The airline issued multiple public apologies, promised comprehensive reviews of their policies, and announced mandatory bias training for every single employee. Not just flight attendants, everyone from pilots to gate agents to corporate executives. The training program they developed has since been adopted by 3 other major airlines. Carol's 5-minute speech on that plane changed industry policy across the country. But perhaps the most beautiful part of this story is what happened with the other passengers. They didn't forget. They didn't move on with their lives and let Carol and Ruth become just another story they'd tell at dinner parties. They stayed in touch. Thomas Whitmore visited Ruth and Carol in Baltimore multiple times during those 18 months. He brought gifts, took them to dinner, and became a sort of grandfather figure in Carol's life. When Ruth passed away, Thomas didn't just send flowers. He established a scholarship fund in Carol's name specifically for children who've lost parents. The Henderson Memorial Scholarship provides financial support for orphan children to pursue education, with preference given to those interested in medicine or social justice. To date, it's helped 47 children across 6 states. Vernon James, the civil rights attorney, did take Ruth's case pro bono. He negotiated a settlement with the airline that provided financial compensation for Ruth and Carol. The amount was confidential, but it was substantial enough to secure Carol's future, to pay for the aunt's relocation to Baltimore, to ensure that Carol would never have to worry about college tuition when the time came. Vernon still calls Carol on her birthday every year. He's told her that when she's ready for law school, if she decides to pursue law instead of or in addition to medicine, he has an internship waiting for her at his firm. Sophia Cruz wrote an in-depth article about the incident that won a regional journalism award. But more importantly, she and Carol became genuine friends. Sophia visits every few months, bringing books and encouragement, documenting Carol's journey as she grows up. She's already planning a follow-up story for when Carol graduates high school, and another for when she gets into medical school. Sophia has told Carol that she's one of the most important people she's ever met, that witnessing Carol's courage changed Sophia's own understanding of what journalism should be, giving voice to people who are trying to be heard. Jean Park and her children send care packages to Carol several times a year. Birthday presents, holiday cards, random surprises in the mail. Her daughter, who's now 12, writes letters to Carol about school and friends and life, and Carol writes back. They've created a pen-pal friendship that's taught both girls about empathy, connection, and how a single shared experience can create bonds that transcend distance and time. And Captain Mitchell Rodriguez? He personally flew Carol and Ruth back to Baltimore after Ruth's treatment was complete. He met them at the gate, walked them onto the plane himself, and made sure they were settled in first class before going to the cockpit. He came back during the flight to check on them, bringing extra snacks and asking Carol about her dreams for the future. When she said she wanted to be a doctor, he told her he had no doubt she would be. That she had the courage and determination to do anything she set her mind to. Captain Rodriguez retired from flying 2 years later, but he never forgot the little girl with the butterfly backpack who taught him something about true bravery. He sends Carol birthday cards every single year without fail. They're always the same, a simple card with a handwritten note that says, "Keep standing up for what's right. Keep being brave. The world needs people like you." Carol keeps every single one in a box under her bed, right next to the photographs of her parents and grandmother. If Carol's journey has inspired you, make sure you subscribe to this channel. We need to share stories of courage like this with the world. Hit that subscribe button right now. Today, Carol sits in the Baltimore Public Library most afternoons after school. She has a favorite corner on the 3rd floor where the light is good and it's quiet enough to concentrate. She spreads medical textbooks across the table, books about anatomy and physiology and pathology that she checks out on her library card. Her purple backpack sits on the chair beside her, and if you look closely, you'll see something new tied to one of the straps. Ruth's silk scarf. The same one Ruth wore on the plane, the one that covered her head during chemotherapy, the one that represented dignity in the face of suffering. Carol has it with her always, a reminder of where she came from and who she's fighting for. Carol looks up from her textbook, and for a moment it's like she can see through the camera, through the screen, directly into the eyes of everyone watching her story. Her voice is older now, more mature, but still carries that same quiet strength that filled an airplane cabin 3 years ago. My grandmother taught me that silence in the face of injustice makes you part of the problem, Carol says, and her words are measured, deliberate, carrying the weight of lessons learned through pain. I was 8 years old and I was scared. Terrified, actually. My hands were shaking, my voice was shaking, everything in me wanted to just be quiet and small and invisible. But I couldn't be silent. Not when they were hurting someone I loved. Not when I could see that what was happening was wrong. She pauses, her hand moving unconsciously to touch the silk scarf on her backpack. A lot of people have told me I was brave. But I don't think I was brave. I think I was just a kid who loved her grandma and couldn't stand watching her be treated badly. I think any of us can do that, stand up when someone we love is being hurt. The hard part is standing up for people we don't know. For strangers. For people who look different from us or talk different from us or live different lives. That's the real courage. That's what my grandmother did her whole life as a teacher. She stood up for kids nobody else wanted to teach. And that's what I'm trying to do now. Carol's eyes are steady, serious beyond her years. If you see something wrong, say something. Even if you're scared. Even if you're small. Even if everyone else is staying quiet. Your voice matters. It really does. I was 8 years old on that plane and my voice changed things. Your voice can change things too. Whether you're 8 or 18 or 80, whether you're in an airplane or a classroom or a grocery store, when you see injustice, when you see someone being treated unfairly because of how they look or where they're from or how much money they have, you have a choice. Stay silent and be part of the problem. Or speak up and be part of the solution. She closes her medical textbook and just before the image fades, you see her smile. It's Ruth's smile, gentle and knowing and full of hope for a future she won't be here to see but helped create anyway. The screen fades to black and white text appears against the darkness. Stand up. Speak out. Even when you're small, your voice matters. The words linger for a moment, then fade. What remains is the truth of Carol's story, the power of her courage, and the reminder that each of us has the ability to change the world by simply refusing to stay silent when silence serves injustice. Carol was 8 years old with thick glasses and a butterfly backpack and a sick grandmother. She had every reason to stay quiet, to accept what the authority figure told her, to avoid conflict and confrontation. But she stood up anyway. She spoke out anyway. And because she did, policies changed, conversations started, and countless other people found the courage to use their own voices. That's the legacy of a little girl on an airplane who loved her grandmother enough to be brave. That's the power of refusing to accept injustice as normal. That's what happens when even the smallest voice insists on being heard. Carol's story isn't just about what happened on one flight. It's about what's possible when any of us decides that enough is enough, that wrong is wrong, and that staying silent isn't an option. What injustice have you witnessed that you wish you'd spoken up about? Share your story in the comments. Let's create a community of people who refuse to stay silent. The screen remains black for a few more seconds, giving viewers time to sit with the story, to feel its impact, to make their own decisions about what they'll do the next time they witness injustice. Because there will be a next time. There's always a next time. The question is, will we be like Carol, standing up despite fear? Or will we be like Kevin, frozen and complicit until someone else takes the lead? Or will we be like the elderly couple, siding with authority simply because it's authority? Carol's story offers us a choice. What we do with that choice is up to each of us.